Welcome to The Conversation, a podcast about technology, instructional design, and the learning sciences. This week we're unpacking the concept of understanding and asking what does it mean to understand something. But before we get started, we have two guests in today's episode, so why don't you introduce yourselves? Let's start with you, Novia.
My name is Yi-Hsin. You can also call me Novia. I'm from Taiwan. Currently, I'm a student for EdTech program, and I enjoy traveling, reading movies, and food.
Hi, I'm Shannon. I am currently getting my master's in educational technology. I'm a special education teacher in Bellport on Long Island, and I really love my dog and country music.
Did you say job or dog?
Dog and job.
Okay. Well, I wanted to start with something that I didn't put on the outline, which is that last semester when I taught this class, I didn't have a week devoted to understanding, and I actually had the 6 facets in the middle, and then I don't think I had the class read the understanding reading. And at the end of the semester, I thought I really should have moved everything up because it's actually more important to have a concept of what does it mean to understand something. So I was wondering, do you think that was the right move?
I think it is important for us to realize what is understanding from what is I acknowledge it. There's a different level of understanding of it. So actually, I read both version, English version of understanding, then Chinese version. I really think it helps me to clarify what is understanding from acknowledge the content.
What was understanding translated into? Just curious.
Understanding is 什么是理解?
Okay, all right.
I think that the understanding chapter was really important because I think there are a lot of confusions between what knowledge and understanding is. So I think it's really important to clear that up before moving on to something else. So I think personally, I felt like that this chapter was important for me to read before getting into the facets of understanding. And especially that chart that is on page 38. It's just a chart that shows bullet points about knowledge and bullet points about understanding. And just even looking at that was really concrete for me and much more helpful in terms of me understanding everything.
So let's get to some topics you want to talk about. Where do you want to start?
For the first reading, understanding. I have one question. What is the distinction between understanding and knowledge? This is what I brought out before. Are they relate to each other? I think we can still find the answer in the reading. But I think in the reading, the third page mentioned the standard that if students understand, then they can prove evidence of what they understand by showing that they know and can do certain specific things. I think this resonates with Bloom's testimony. Based on the testimony, there are different levels of understanding. The very basic level is to acknowledge the knowledge by leveling up, comprehending equally to understand the content. In other words, know and remember the content is the knowledge you have. Aside from that, be able to explain it with a variety of ways in your own language shows you already comprehend the content. On the other hand, knowledge and understanding are related. John Dewey summarized the ideas of understanding versus understanding of learners. For instance, the fact is knowledge and the meaning of fact is the understanding. Furthermore, I know something to be true versus I understand what it is and why it makes it knowledge. Read a story for an example. Read the lines of the story is the knowledge, and to infer the story by reading lines to lines and generate meaning from it is to comprehend. What is more, in this reading, the 8th page, knowledge and skills, then are necessary elements of understanding. It further illustrates what understanding is, to comprehend and the ability to transfer it, and further to reply it in any other appropriate situation is essential for understanding. Lastly, frequently asking ourselves questions are assisting us better understanding the content.
It looks like you answered your own question.
Yes. I read a script for it.
Yeah,
I'm
I
very
know.
nervous.
People are going to think this is scripted.
I just look at knowledge more so as being almost like facts, like the facts that you know about something. And then understanding, being able to generalize information and the meaning. I think that's like the biggest word throughout this entire chapter is the meaning behind something, and being able to transfer it, which kind of then brings me to my question of teaching, transferring, because I feel like that is a difficult thing to teach. I almost feel the only way to teach it is to almost model it and let students kind of try it out themselves. I think my biggest question throughout the whole chapter is that how do you teach understanding almost? I think it's something that has to come from within. So it's something I've found that I struggle with as a teacher is teaching that transferring component.
So can you give a scenario, maybe like invent one even?
Well, I think that essentially the reason it is more challenging, I feel, in my field is because I teach students with severe intellectual disabilities. So that understanding component might have to be like deeper looked into. It's not so much on the surface all the time.
Sure.
So I think that is something, like I said, I struggle with. But even just looking back on when I would student teach with general education, like I know like I often would have to give, tests, quizzes, and, I could see that they were getting answers right. But, if you sat down and almost had a conversation with a student, it was kind of apparent to me that maybe like they didn't understand, the content of, the science lesson. Maybe they at the surface were answering questions, multiple choice questions, but I don't feel there were moments that I noticed that they didn't truly understand the content or could generalize it into different terms. So I feel like that is something, like I said, as a teacher that I find difficult.
I thought when the reading, that chapter talked about what we can learn from student misunderstanding, you can find out a lot about why transfer isn't happening or why it's not happening in the right way. And I thought it was really interesting when it said, and this under, I think this is probably starting page 50, about how when students can understand all the facts but take away the wrong message. And so just because you have the facts, and this addresses your question, Novia, which is that the or Shannon, you talked about the chart. You can have all the facts, right? That's the knowledge column, but the understanding is being able to organize it in a way that is correct. And part of the things that we've talked about so far, we read about it initially, is the importance of the organizing framework, right? This is the Bransford reading, and so you get all the facts, which is an important start. But if you end there, then you haven't completed the job. You still need to provide the organizing principle, and when you see student misunderstanding or unable to transfer, then you can get a sense of like maybe they're kind of mapping it the wrong way. And I also like the fact that they said misunderstandings are important for teachers. And I believe it was in, I know in the voice threads, a few of you brought up the importance of risk taking. And I think that was anytime your students feel safe to take a risk, that provides an opportunity for you to assess whether they are misunderstanding something, right? If they keep it all to themselves, then you don't see it. And they could even get the answers right, but they're not necessarily able to transfer it. So I think that's an important takeaway.
The second one I want to talk about is the evidence of understanding. based on you guys' experience, what do you think it's the evidence of understanding from students or yourself?
Well, that actually ties into why I find it to be difficult, because I think, like you said, the evidence has to come from within, from the student. And most times I feel like I'm not, a lot of times if I have a student that is not very vocal or risk-taking, I'm only really seeing that evidence with one-on-one time with them. So a lot of times if I have assessments, I will review them individually with a student. And I feel like that is when I'm noticing most of the evidence on if they actually understand or if they don't. I try to hold like many like discussions in class, because I feel like that is when I'm understanding most if they are generalizing the information, when they are giving exact examples, if they are able to put things into different terms. So I feel like the evidence doesn't come from me having a piece of paper that has them answering multiple choice questions. It comes from more conversation-based times. So I think that would be where I see most of the evidence of understanding from my experience.
For myself, I think in the reading of page 48 talk about how to get evidence of understanding. Also on page 50 talk about we as an educator we should know that different kinds of assessment embody the different standard of understanding, and how we design the assignment and what kind of question we ask the students will result in a variety of learning outcomes. So I think it's a mutual way for students and teachers. Students will respond to what you request them to do. And the very key component of whether we will mislead the student or not is how we design the question and what format we interact with the students. So take a quiz or homework, for example. If we test student just yes no question and we didn't ask them why, and maybe we will get, as Shannon mentioned before, we will only get the correct answer, but do they really understand it? It's a question. And how we design the assignment, I think the student will learn from our patterns as well. They will know what type of question we will ask. Then they will prepare only a part of it, and maybe a reading is really long, or maybe the contents is very important. Some other part, which is I think is resonant with the expert blinds part, but I'm not sure whether I interpret it correctly, so I bring it up. That's what I think. How we design the course, how we interact.
We have a whole week on assessment, so we're going to talk about that more deeply. So I don't want to cover that too much, but just a quick preview is that, especially in schools, that might be a little bit different outside of schools, which is that you want to first make sure that you have a variety of assessments, so that it's just not one thing. So because it's kind of like doing research, right? If you do one type of research, assuming that the research is well designed, you will get an answer or insight into one piece of it, but you want a variety. So you might have a quiz, you might have a discussion, you might have a performance, a demonstration, or a writing, and so on. So as much variety of it as you can will give you a more broader insight, because then you can see some people are really good at test taking, or some people are not so good are shy at discussions, and you don't want them. That doesn't mean they don't understand, right? So that's one response. The other one, the upcoming reading we'll talk about, which I find kind of really helpful when designing assessment, is there are two fundamental questions to ask. One is, can someone who doesn't know the topic do well in the assessment? And can someone who does know the topic do poorly on the assessment? And if the answer is yes to either of them, then that assessment is not good, because you're not measuring what you want to measure. But we'll get to that soonish.
In that box, it's like so it's page 38, and it's the figure 2.1. So as I said, I felt like this was helpful for me to kind of break down the difference between the two. But I read that with knowledge, it says I respond on cue that with what I know, and with understanding, I judge when to and when to not use what I know. And I think that just kind of surprised me. I don't know that I totally understand why, with understanding, you judge when to and when not to use something or to say something, because I feel like if you understand something, you would be more certain of it. So you'd be more willing to respond because you are more sure of it. So I think that was something that kind of like made me stop when I was reading to make sure I was reading it right, and to kind of think about that for a second.
Do you mean that they're switched?
Yeah, I almost was surprised to hear that you judge when and when to not use what you know when you understand something. I felt like that was surprising to me because understanding I look at as a deeper meaning. So to judge when and when to not use what you understand was kind of surprising to me. I would think that you'd be more open to sharing it.
Could you give us an example of that sentence? I'm a little bit lost now.
So it's in the table on page 38. I think Shannon was asking why the I judge when to know is under understanding instead of knowledge.
Oh, okay, I got it now. Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Novia?
To me, I think when I learn something new, I think I understand it. But when it's time for me to apply it to make a product or to write something about it, that's the timing, the true timing that's to judge whether I truly understand it or not, which is also in the bullet points. The phase of understanding is how to apply it and organize it.
Well, I think that was my reading as well, or my interpretation as well, in that I think the key word is the judge part, which is to know when something applies or not. So, Novia, you mentioned Bloom's taxonomy earlier. That is kind of at a higher level, like knowing when to apply and knowing when not to apply. Because I think the difference is that when you have an initial understanding of something, people might kind of just try to apply it whenever they can, even though they're not necessarily applying the right facts at the right time. At least from my end, I often see that where students may be really eager to apply something they've learned and kind of make a connection where there isn't necessarily one or isn't necessarily the best one. And I think that's the key part, the judgment part, is to, once you know something, do you apply it at the right time? I am trying to think of an example.
That is why like finding an example of that is difficult for me. So I think that's why I'm like had a hard time understanding. But when you use the word judgment to kind of like when to apply it, I think the when part is clicking with me more now.
I have one example. Maybe because I was a K-12 English teacher before in China, and I think one example we can use here is because we need to attract students' attention, so we know a lot of different type of games to cooperate it with the content, so that we can practice. We can draw the students, and we know what content suitable for each specific type of games. I judge when to use it and when not to use what I know. Maybe that's an example of it. You can decide which games to apply on different content.
So that's judgment on the teacher's part, right?
Yeah.
Like pedagogical knowledge.
Yes, and also you need to put the content in the consideration. For example, if you're going to teach kindergarten kids the song, you are not going to make them do the writing part. Yeah, put that in mind. The age of the students and the ability of the students and what contents suitable, what type of games or practice.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good example, but like in one of my classes, we're kind of reading about the multimedia principle, a multimedia theory, which Novia, you are familiar with, I hope. And I asked students to analyze a video about it. And I think I saw a difference between students who applied it just whenever they saw instances of the video aligning or not aligning with it, and then others who are a little bit more nuanced to say, actually, this may violate this principle, but actually in this context it makes sense, kind of thing. And I felt like that is a key difference between knowing the theory and then knowing when to apply it properly. I don't know if that's a good example, but just kind of off the top of my head, that's kind of what I can come up with.
Thing I want to bring up is from reading. I saw reading deeply rooted misconceptions. One of the example is history is about the facts. What happened, science is about finding causes. This is a misconception because what do you guys think?
Like thinking about that, the misconceptions, I felt like they're very prominent. Like there's many deeply rooted misconceptions that I think we often overlook. And I agree with you on history is about facts, what happens, science is about finding causes. Like I feel like I myself have that misconception. So yeah, I agree. That was something that was confusing to me.
Before I entered this program, I don't know much about media manipulation, and I don't know not much about bias. But after this program, I think because I read something and learn something about it, so I understand why maybe the history is not all the facts. And yeah, because a historian is a storyteller, because maybe the editor and also maybe the publisher, they are biased, or they have their standpoints, so they might edit things in different ways. That's a part of media manipulation. I think that's why. Because for example, even for the same time, the different country have different history textbook. For example, I'm not sure this is a good thing to bring up, but before like 1930 something, 36 or 31st, I forgot the exactly year. Japan has a war. Japan and China and Taiwan has a war, and they have the army in Taiwan, and they force some women to do the comfort soldier things, but in Japan's textbook, they didn't make it inside their textbook, history textbook. But this is all well known in other countries like Taiwan and China. So I think that's a part of the bias or even manipulation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole different category even. Because you are, I don't know, that's kind of a, that's bordering, not even bordering, that's propaganda. So just to get back to your question, do you understand why they use that as an example? The history is about facts example?
Sometimes I think there is a fine line between maybe misunderstanding something and how someone perceives something. On a teacher's standpoint, the misunderstanding and maybe someone just perceiving something, like a student perceiving a certain topic, is something that I kind of struggle with. I think that this reading does a good job on explaining misunderstandings, like especially when they map out the example of like one of our children asks Dad are Spanish and English using the same words. I think those are more concrete examples, whereas sometimes in the field I see a little bit of a fine line, like I said, between how maybe a student is just perceiving something or if they're misunderstanding it. So that's like something I think as a teacher I kind of need to work on, to pinpoint exactly which one is happening.
Like the root of it.
Right, exactly.
Why don't we transition to the other reading, the 6 facets thing? I had a question. In the classrooms where you grew up, which facets of understanding do you think were most often emphasized? So where did you grow up, first of all?
I grew up in Taiwan, and I think the elementary education in Taiwan is more like very, how do I say it? Very didactic. I mean, means the answer is only one. There's no other. The education system, from my personal perspective, is very didactic. It's not allowing students to think why the teacher is asking me this question, what this concept might possibly relate to another field, or it's not easy for students to have the creativity, I think. So for me, I think the most emphasized is to understanding, to know what the content is, to memorize this, which is very basic. But
so which facet would that be under?
I think it's the first one. You can explain what it is. You can give the teacher the correct answer, but actually, you ask me why and how to apply. It's a gap. Yeah, we don't have a perspective of it.
I actually feel exact opposite. I think that where I grew up in Sayville, which is like a very small town on the south shore of Long Island, and very small class sizes. So there was always a lot of room for like discussion. And, you know, we would have debates, and we were able to like express ourselves, in a creative way. You know, a lot of times, like, my assignments were like, we were given choices. Like, you can either write a paper, you can give a presentation, you could make a song. So I actually feel that where I grew up and how my schooling was big on having perspective, and big on interpreting and applying from those facets, because we were constantly given choices to kind of like individualize and show our personalities. So I feel less of how you feel, Novia, and more so that I was given a lot of freedom, I think is the word that I'm looking for, to express.
You were lucky.
Yeah, I was, definitely. And I'm not saying every single teacher even did that. I feel like there are certain teachers that I had that were more so on that, giving you the freedom. Like, for example, in high school, I know I had an economics class, and there was definitely no freedom of expressing myself so much in that class. It was just more paper, pencil, do this test, you have to pass this class to graduate. But then in my, English class, we were constantly expressing ourselves. If you, wanted to, like I said, write a paper, or if you didn't want to write the paper, you could make a PowerPoint. So I feel like, luckily, I had those experiences.
Okay.
What is understanding aside from the academic field? So for my example, I want to answer this first. I think there's a phrase, I was in your shoes. It is saying that we know for the expression that you understand how other people feel, or you were in the same situation before. I think this is one example of, apart from the understanding of the academic field. This is one phase of understanding in real life, to have empathy, and being able to understand how other people's standpoint. I think to do this, one important component is you need to respect the people that you're trying to understand it. So you open your mind to understand how they feel.
What did you mean by aside from the academic field? I guess I wasn't sure about that part.
Okay, that means besides learning and teaching part, I mean, in our daily life, or...
Oh, actually, so that's a good question. So what would this look like in a non-K-12 setting?
Yes, or even aside from the teaching and learning part.
Shannon, do you have thoughts on that? I know you do work in the K-12, so...
Right, but I do agree on the whole empathy part. I think that is a difficult thing to, not so much to teach, but to see all the time. Like, I know myself, I feel like I'm very empathetic, but I have friends that I actually feel very much so lack that. And I think that is a difficult thing to teach, actually, especially in a school setting, in an academic field. And I think the way we present empathy is very varied. Someone could be empathetic, just the way that it is perceived and skewed might just be maybe not as easy to see. So out of all the facets, I actually think that is the most difficult if I had to pick one, the whole empathy piece of it, because I also think it kind of depends a little bit on your background of growing up as a person. Like, I feel like empathy is something that comes from within, maybe how you were raised or your experiences in life, not so much in an academic setting. So I actually feel that is one that I can see in a different light that isn't from an academic field standpoint.
I think it might help to have an example. So, like, if you're studying history on your own, like I often do, you still need to keep in mind that it's not enough to just understand what happened, but also why, and to put yourself in the shoes of the people. The same would go for learning in other settings, like I think of corporate training, for example. If you want to make sure ideally that your employees know why the procedures are the way they are, why they're doing things, and they need perspective and empathy, especially if they're going to be working with people. And those are all part of understanding.
Perspective is so interesting to me. So I wrote, interpretation is obviously so individualized, and I think that's what makes us so diverse, makes a classroom so interesting. Like, I just think interpretation is like the best part of a classroom because each person interprets things very differently. Even in like a slight example, just I have a teaching assistant in my room, and I might tell him, can you make me this quickly? And it comes back and it's totally not what I was thinking. And he totally just interpreted what I said totally different, but in such a cool way. And I think with interpretation lies so many strengths. It like brings out someone else's strengths. And that whole component of like I said, diversity. So that's why I wrote, like, is interpretation really ever wrong? Can anyone really ever lack interpretation? Like, I don't think so. I think everybody has, like, a unique way about them. So I feel like that is, one of the ones that I think everybody really can have is interpretation. So I think I actually answered my own question when writing that, because I don't think you really could ever be wrong with how you interpret something because it's so individualized.
Yes.
You might be able to say that there are levels of support for interpretation. Like, if you can support it, then I think it's good. Because if you can't, then it's just a random opinion, right? You don't want to go too far. You still want to make sure that interpretations are kind of supported by some reasoning, some evidence, some kind of process behind it. But otherwise, I think that's right. Novia, you had an interesting question about interpretation.
On page 92, didactic teaching of interpretation will mislead students about the truly arguable nature of all interpretation, but I think under some circumstances, it is difficult to avoid didactic teaching. How do we better avoid this? I think it's more like when it's the very fundamental education, like elementary or kindergarten.
I think that because they're talking specifically about interpretation, right? So I think they are trying to say that didactic teaching of interpretation is problematic for the same reason you mentioned earlier, because you're saying that people come with different interpretations. And so a didactic teaching implies that the teacher is saying, this is how you interpret this text, or this is how I interpret this thing, which by definition kind of robs it from the students. I think that's kind of what they mean. So specifically in relation to interpretation, didactic teaching should be avoided. You might use it elsewhere. I think I agree that it might be hard to avoid it realistically, but specifically in relation to interpretation, I think that's what they meant.
I think there are only 6 facets. We almost cover the 4. And the last 2 is self-knowledge and intellectual rationalization and the key implementation of the facts of teaching and learning.
Right, so where kind of metacognition, intellectual rationalization falls under, right? Do you have a question about it, or?
My last question was how we might have all those facets of learning, but some components might be stronger than others, because that's how I feel personally. So I wrote, can one meet 6 facets of learning, but not really be strong on some components? Maybe they have it, but they don't show it as much. And that's kind of how, especially I felt about like empathy, and the interpretation, like things like that. Like, I think some people might have all of those, maybe like within, maybe they're not easily shown, but they do have them. So that's just something that it's kind of just like a ponder for a thought, like not even so much a question. I just think like through those facets, I can kind of see where, like I said, we can see different students' strengths or what makes us diverse in some sense.
For me, they refer to different ways of showing understanding. They're not so much about what the person is able, like whether they have more or less empathy than the other person. I think it's more like a reminder to teachers or educators to remember that there are different ways of, it's kind of like Bloom's taxonomy as well. It's like there are different ways of demonstrating understanding, or understanding involves all these different things. And you want to try to make sure you don't emphasize one and not the others, which I think, Novia, you mentioned, like you're growing up, your classes might have been more about explaining, but not enough about the other things. So I think that is my takeaway from the 6 facets. So I agree. Like, I think that depending on what you're teaching, definitely some will apply more than others. But the important thing is to know that understanding is not just one thing, but it's very different ways.
Because the last phase is to
Self-knowledge?
Yeah, self-knowledge, yes. To be aware what you don't understand. I think it's difficult because sometimes we will think we understand it, but when it's time to do something about it, and you realize that, you don't really understand very deeply. Or I think to do is more difficult than to just read it or to talk about it.
I feel a little differently on it, I think nobody knows better than yourself if you understand something. That's how I feel. But at the same rate, I think that's a really difficult component. Like, it's a very high skill to have that last facet, to kind of know yourself enough to know if you're understanding something or what you need to change to better understand something. So I think it's kind of a mature thing to have. But I think almost like the root of it, to really like that self-awareness, to know that you understand something or you don't understand something, and the action you need to take to fix it.
Well, certainly in this class, you have like the metacognition reflection thing. You have the forms, like there are prompts and things you can do that ask students to do more of this more explicitly, because otherwise it's inside your head, right? So I think that's kind of how I would recommend going about it, because then if you ask students to kind of reflect more on things and then ask them to kind of make connections, ideally that would cause self-knowledge to happen. Because otherwise it is difficult, because usually when you assess understanding, you're not looking for self-knowledge unless you build that into your design, I guess. So I think that's kind of how I would go about it. I think that wraps up this episode. I want to thank you both for coming on.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Shannon.
Have a great weekend.
You too.